The woods felt alive, watching me, their breath tangled with mine as I tore through the underbrush. My chest heaved, and the air thick with the rot of damp earth and decaying leaves. The trees loomed above, ancient and cruel, their twisted limbs clawing at the thinning light. The forest wasn't new to me. It had haunted the edges of my sleep for years, its shadowy trails threading through the fabric of my worst nightmares. But now, under the suffocating weight of its silence, the dream felt fragile, unworthy of the real thing. These trails were wrong. They were too deliberate, too neatly carved to belong in this wild place. Their shape was deliberate and had a purpose. The thought wormed into my head. These aren't trails. They're traps. And then a twig snapped to my left, and I spun, heart hammering, and caught the flicker of movement, something unnatural shifting in the undergrowth. My hand moved before my mind caught up. The knife flashed through the air, its blade a sharp whisper against the forest's oppressive quiet. Something burst from the tree line, fast, too fast. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a person. It was all shadow, its movements jagged, and its shape learned how to bend in real time. And the knife buried itself into its chest. The sound of splintering wood was faint. The handle slammed into the snarling mouth of a vampire, shaking the wooden image on whatever held it in place. And I cursed. I had been too hasty in my throw, and when I heard a sound to my right, I turned and I threw another one. The blade struck a werewolf, its arm raised to grab, but only a glancing blow. It sliced against the wood before falling to the ground, the wood trembling a little. Then I cursed again, but kept moving. My legs screamed as I forced myself forward, stumbling down the uneven ground. My orders were clear. Keep your heart rate above the threshold. Don't let it drop. If it does, you start over. And I couldn't. Not again. But the creatures didn't care about my limits. They were hurting me, driving me deeper into the woods, deeper into the place where the trees whispered hunger and the air itself conspired to drown me. The sound echoing around me, relentless, each impact vibrating with malice. I didn't care to look back. I really couldn't. Because I knew if I did, I'd see something closing in. And I spun and I threw, and for a wonder, I hit the target. I spun again, throwing a second knife, but this one collided with the target handle first, and then I realized I was out of knives. And so I stood there, hands on my knees, dragging air into my lungs like a man who had just narrowly avoided drowning. And somewhere behind me, the forest was quiet again, save for the rhythmic hum of cicadas. My uncle, on the other hand, emerged from the shadows of the brush like he was out for a stroll, flipping a knife end over end on his hand, not a single drop of sweat marring his brow. And then when he threw the knife, I flinched on instinct, diving for the dirt before I even realized what was happening. The blade sang past me, its journey punctuated by a solid, wet thud. Not the sound of a handle hitting its mark.
"Thought I'd finish the job for you,"
he said, his voice clipped but calm. I twisted to look, dirt clinging to my palms. A woman stood there, her hands gripping her purse so tight that her knuckles had gone white. The knife that I'd thrown was still lodged in the bag, dead center on her stomach. But his blade, that was buried square between her eyes.
"If you're gonna go around wounding innocent bystanders,"
he said, stepping closer and folding his arms,
"at least have the decency to put them down properly."
"Shit," I muttered, sagging under his gaze. I'm just struggling with these damn knives, okay?"
"I noticed,"
he said dryly, tilting his head.
"You're throwing it like a grenade, not a clean release. Breathe out when you throw. Let it flow."
"Why not just use grenades?" I asked, standing and brushing dirt off of my jeans. I tugged the knife free from the woman's purse, avoiding the vacant look into her unseeing eyes. Or, I don't know, guns? Wouldn't most vampires tear my throat out before I can even throw one of these things? And he snatched the knife from me with a long, suffering sigh, holding it up for emphasis.
"This is a 12.5-inch silver blade. double-edged, needle-sharp, and heavy enough to punch through bone if thrown properly. Do you have any idea what one of these costs?
30, $40. And then his expression darkened.
Try 80 a piece. And when you finally prove that you're not a complete liability, you'll get 5 in your kit. That's $400 of silver knives alone. Now, he continued, spinning the knife in his fingers, do you know how much a silver bullet costs?
And I shrugged. Less than $80 a pop, I guess.
$15 per round. And once you fired it, that's it. Gone. Let's just say that you've got a 15-round mag loaded up. You're looking at $250 just for silver ammo. So if your aim with a gun is as shitty as it is with a knife, I'm not about to waste money on range fees or precious ammunition.
And with that, we walked in silence, back towards the house. My uncle idly tossed one of his knives in the air, catching it by the handle each time without looking. There was a rhythm to it, as natural as breathing, and I couldn't help but watch. 7 knives were strapped to his thigh, each in its own leather sheath. 2 more hung from his belt, his satchel, a battered thing about the size of my mom's purse, jingling faintly with every step. Holy water, iron nails, salt rounds, it was a hunter's grab bag of horrors. And of course, the Glock 19 on his side, 3 loaded magazines snug in their pouches. Uncle Vesemir went armed like he expected war at any moment, which, to be fair, he probably did. And after the incident at Walmart, where security almost called the cops on him for the arsenal strapped to his person, I'd insisted that I would take over the shopping. He had muttered something about the indignity of civilian life, but he relented. And his reasoning?
You never know when you'll be attacked, boy. My reputation is as lofty as it is deadly.
And that was Vesemir in a nutshell. Half grizzled warrior, half insufferable windbag. When he wasn't dragging me through the wilderness or putting me through some hellish training, he taught these classes. These lectures were absolutely relentless.
What's the best way to kill a vampire?
He asked, his voice cutting through the early evening air as we hiked up the trails. The sky was a dull slate, first stars just beginning to glint. Decapitation? I ventured.
Yes, but...
I groaned. After decapitating it, stake it through the heart, crossbow bolt, holy water, if you can catch them off guard.
Good.
He nodded approvingly.
And kelpies?
And I paused, racking my brain. Cold iron, right? Since they're fey. He stopped mid-step, turning to face me with an expression that could curdle milk.
Silver bullet,
he corrected.
They dissolve into moss or float some afterward. Now you owe me 20 push-ups when we get back.
I groaned audibly this time.
Werewolves.
Silver bullet, I said quickly.
Correct. Though silver anything will work in a pinch. Renfields.
I hesitated. They're just humans, right? So anything that kills a human, gun, knife, whatever. And he tilted his head, chewing the thought over like a piece of gristle.
Technically correct. But Renfields are durable, stronger than humans, and sometimes capable of withstanding more punishment. Silver or holy artifacts work well against them too. And since you gave me half answer, let's go ahead and add 5 more push-ups to that.
How generous, I muttered under my breath as we reached the house. And he stopped me at the door, his eyes glinting in the low light.
Last question, and you can have your dinner. How would you kill a Van Helsing?
And that one caught me off guard. But I laughed and said, easily, a high-powered rifle from a quarter mile away. Or, I don't know, orbital satellite strike. And he laughed with a rumble. It was a genuine sound, and he clapped me on the shoulder.
Flattering. Go eat. Don't forget those push-ups before bed.
And I nodded, heading upstairs to see what culinary abomination he'd thrown together this time. Despite his larger-than-life demeanor, Uncle Vesemir was a surprisingly decent cook. He'd been living with me ever since the day that I came home to find him sitting in my living room, cross-legged, sipping tea like he owned the place. And for him, he would have loved for me to be his successor in the Van Helsing line, whether I wanted to be or not. Still, I was able to stave off this notion from him for now. And I guess it wasn't all bad. The training had pushed me into the best shape of my life, even if it left every muscle in my body screaming for reprieve. And my days blurred together. Drills in the morning, work dragging through the afternoon, and sleep so heavy it felt like I was slipping into a coma. I was tired, aching, and maybe a little bitter, but I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't at least a little grateful for Vesemir's relentless presence. And then there was Sarah. She understood in her quiet way. She had her own struggles, ones that she didn't share and didn't seem eager to allude to. But they weighed on her. They kept her busy and stole away her time just as surely as my training did. Still, we found ways to stay connected. Most nights, no matter how ragged I felt, we made a point of FaceTiming each other. Even if it was just for a few minutes, staring into each other's face through flickering screens. At least it was something. A tether to remind us both that, despite everything pulling us apart, we were still here. Still trying. Uncle Vesemir and I did have to come to an understanding early in our whole Yoda-Luke arrangement if this was going to work. He constantly reminded me that he had this grand vision. 3 months of uninterrupted training, the mortuary shut down entirely, and me dedicating 6 to 8 hours a day, 6 days a week to become his perfect protege. Sundays, of course, would be reserved for Catholic Mass, because in his mind, nothing capped off a week of grueling drills better than sitting in a pew contemplating my sins. And according to him, 3 months of this regime would mold me into the perfect weapon, one as formidable as any Navy SEAL or Crusader of the Cross. There were just a few problems with his plan. First, 3 months without work would mean no income, and no income meant that I'd be in incredible shape but pitching a tent under a freeway overpass. Second, I was raised Lutheran, essentially Catholic light, and there was no way that I was sitting through Mass. Not that I had anything against Catholics, but being non-denominational was the kind of thing that could earn you a lifetime of judgmental side eyes from a congregation. And honestly, I wasn't keen on fighting to stay awake through what would undoubtedly feel like an endless service. And so I countered. All right, I'll train with you first thing in the morning and again after closing, barring any sort of emergency. Unfortunately, the negotiation dragged on longer than it should have. Me pointing out the necessity for paying bills and him lamenting how this would stretch the training into decades. But eventually, with all the enthusiasm of a man swallowing broken glass, he relented. Fine, he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. But only if you stop accusing me of terrorizing your clients. I couldn't help but laugh at that, though I swallowed it quickly. You do terrify my clients, and the ones who don't run for the hills are too freaked out to come back. And he crossed his arms, looking offended. If they fear me, it's because they have something to hide. Fear is the companion of guilt, not my doing. And we disagreed on that point. Vehemently. This whole arrangement had become necessary after Uncle Vesemir managed to scare off 3 of my red envelope clients in just 1 month. Well, technically 2, one of them came back, but only after I had slashed the rate so deeply that it felt like charity work. The real problem was his affinity for lurking. He had an infuriating habit of skulking around in the shop like a storm cloud with legs, lurking in the dark corners or standing motionless in the middle of a room as though posing for a horror movie poster. Even I wasn't immune. There were days when I'd walk into a room and nearly drop my coffee when I found him standing silently in the shadows. And so, when the mole man, the Taupidae, spotted him brooding in the showroom, his reaction was understandable. "Honor!" the mole man shrieked before promptly tunneling through my floor, foundation, and quite possibly my sanity. And then there was the aftermath, involving me trying to explain the damage to a very skeptical contractor. I threw around words like settling issues and natural wear and tear. And then I slid him a thick envelope of cash to keep the questions to a minimum. He patched the hole, shrugged, and then he left. It wasn't ideal, but it was a system. And in this line of work, that was probably as good as it was going to get. The second incident had been when Uncle Vesemir had wandered into a funeral for some river nomads. They were like dryads, but with more of a transient waterlogging vibe. Think less tree hugging and more shoreline lurking. The moment that he stepped through the door, the entire crowd screamed and bolted for the exits. To be fair, though, Uncle V hadn't really been trying to cause a scene. He had just been looking for the remote so he could watch his beloved soap operas. God forbid that you did anything to make him miss Days of Our Lives. But the nomads didn't know that. The matriarch, a sea nymph who was both mossy and bossy, demanded a refund, and I barely scraped by with the amount that she had already paid. The third incident involved a ghoul that I'd been suspicious of. It had been sitting there talking about preparations, while wiping slobber from its mouth with the back of its hand. And I had a gut feeling that it meant to make me its next meal at the funeral feast. But then Uncle Vesemir walked into my office without knocking. The ghoul, realizing that it wasn't going to get any hospitality, decided to make a run for it. And it leapt straight out of my office window and didn't look back. Well, that sure put a stop to whatever plans that we were trying to negotiate. And so that's when I decided that I needed to implement a new set of rules. Rule number 1. Uncle Vesemir is to stay upstairs during business hours unless there was an emergency, or unless he was willing to ditch his weapons and uniform for normal clothes. He, of course, rejected this idea with all of the enthusiasm of a knight protesting armor maintenance. His uniform wasn't just clothing. It was a symbol of his station, even if it made him look like a second-rate Geralt from The Witcher. The only time that he'd remove it was for washing, and even then it was only once a week. And this quickly soon became twice a week after the furniture began smelling like a sweaty guy encased in leather. Rule number 2, which was less negotiable. I needed to keep working if I wanted to pay bills. The day of leaning on Mom's Social Security checks were long gone. These days, the house and the business were my responsibility. Uncle Vesemir loved to tell me that I could be making double what I earned working with him. But considering that he'd spent the last 2 months camped out on my couch, binge-watching General Hospital and the occasional MASH episode, which admittedly I actually kind of enjoyed those ones, his business acumen was starting to feel questionable. My cash flow had taken a serious hit, especially after I'd previously spent 3 months wallowing in self-pity after my mom's funeral, and if I didn't stay sharp, taxes were going to be a problem this year. As much as Uncle V grumbled about it, I not only preferred to, but had no choice but to keep the mortuary running. And as always, Uncle Vesemir made it crystal clear how little he thought of my business.
You make arrangements that are too far generous for the half-breeds that you bury,
Uncle Vesemir grumbled.
They deserve to rot in a ditch, not buried with honors.
And I opened my mouth to argue, but he silenced me with a harsh snap.
They are not people, he spat. Don't even try to claim otherwise. They are the ill-begotten spawn of forced copulation, abominations created by poor choices and even worse morals. The creatures that I hunt are noble beasts. The filth that you service aren't even fit for my trophy room.
I couldn't help but remind him that I did business with several of those noble beasts. The response was a vacant stare and a grunt that said more than words ever could. And so, that brought us to Rule 3. A rule that was becoming increasingly difficult to enforce, especially after nearly getting Corey killed. And Rule 3 was simple. Do not attack people who have been invited into my home. I got lucky that night that I had to add that rule to the list. It could have ended a lot worse. I was knee-deep in paperwork when a weird noise cut through the air, followed by some frantic scuffling. And I tried to shake it off, but something gnawed at me to check it out. And good thing I listened to that gut feeling. What I walked in on was a sight that I never thought that I'd see. There was Uncle Vesemir, knife drawn, and Corey, my best friend, pinned to the wall with a stake through his chest. Corey was struggling weakly, unable to pull himself free. My uncle had him in a vice grip, preparing to deliver a fatal blow. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, my voice freezing them both in place. And Corey looked at me with wide eyes, half terrified and half confused. I realized that I had arrived just in time. And Uncle Vesemir didn't even look fazed.
"Had a vampire creeping around. I'm handling it."
And I stood there speechless, a flood of disbelief rushing through me, but then finally I shouted, "Get off of him! That's Corey, my friend, the one who delivers my supplies, the one that I give my blood to. I told you about him!" And then Uncle Vesemir gave a grunt, sheathing his knife as though he'd just finished killing a bug. And I rushed over, yanking the stake from Corey's chest. He gasped, scrambling to his feet, and bolted for the door, the supplies that he dropped forgotten as he made his escape. And I tried to call after him, my voice a frantic mess, apologizing, trying to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, that he could come back. But I knew it was pointless. The damage was done. And I turned back to Uncle Vesemir, a fire in my chest. "If he had gotten in without knocking," I said, seething, "don't you think that he had an invitation?" And my uncle bristled, his voice low.
"I offer to kill a vamp for you. And you make me the bad guy. Why the hell are you trading your blood with vamps in the first place?"
"Hey, I don't owe you an explanation." I threw my hands up, the frustration boiling over. "Just ask before you go around killing my house guests. Right?" And he rolled his eyes, muttering something about taking it under advisement. I guess that was the best that I could get, for now. Later, Victoria called, furious. She gave me an earful about maybe warning people that I had a psychotic monster hunter living under my roof. And I reassured her that it wouldn't happen again. I did feel bad for not giving Corey a heads up, though. He'd been letting himself in, restocking my supplies, taking my pre-drawn blood from the fridge, and leaving. We hadn't really crossed paths in months. It had been a pretty hands-off arrangement. But still, the whole thing could have been avoided if I had just given him a proper warning. But that is to say that Rule 3 didn't come back to bite me about a week later, though not in the way that I expected. I was parking the hearse for a service the next morning when 4 freshly turned vampires, likely homeless, emerged from the shadows of the early evening. One of them had me by the throat before he could notice my charm. His hand was smoking, but it didn't seem to be having any effect on his grip. I managed to gurgle, the vampire's dissolving fingers cutting off my air supply.
"You sure that these guys don't have an invitation?"
he asked, mocking me. But I couldn't muster enough breath to respond. And then Uncle Vesemir sighed, but proceeded not to waste any more time. He took the vampire's hand off the wrist, and then followed up with a clean decapitation. I slumped against the car, fumbling for one of my knives, but by the time that I could move, the show was already over. Watching him work was like watching a well-rehearsed ballet. He spun, tossing a dagger into one of the vampires while simultaneously drawing his gun and taking out the second. The dagger hit its mark and the gunshots rang out, every round landing true. The remaining 2 vampires staggered, their bodies jerking in place, then went still. The one that he decapitated crumbled like a rag doll, its hand dissolving into a fine powder that coated me from head to toe. Uncle Vesemir moved to the other 2, dispatching them with brutal precision, heads rolling, bodies kicked away from the hearse.
"If you want to keep that,"
he said, nodding towards my vehicle,
"you better move it."
I scrambled to my feet, rushing to move the hearse out of the line of fire. And once it was safely out of the way, Uncle Vesemir finished the job with a quick flick of his wrist, setting the pile of vampires ablaze. It was messy, sure, but it was hard to argue with the results. And his paranoia? Well, I suppose it was justified, after all. Aside from his obsessions with soap operas and vampire slaying, one of the few perks of having Uncle Vesemir around was his cooking. The man could make something out of the barest scraps, like the random stuff that I had in my cabinet, and turn it into something unpronounceable but mouth-wateringly good. I could taste the hamburger helper, the faint powdery remnants from the box, but it all blended into a dish that screamed Italy despite its humble origins. "I need to go out after dark," I said, freezing his fork midair. "Alone?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he slid a bite of food in, not even flinching at my interruption. "Well, unless you want to join me to meet with a vampire," I shot back, my tone matching his. He scoffed, his lips curling in disdain. "If you're going to rub elbows with filth, you can do it alone. Just make sure that you got your charms in your kit." My kit was more practical than it sounded. A silver cross, a couple of short silver knives, holy water in a thermos, some iron nails, and a squirt gun filled with gasoline, as well as a Zippo lighter. Those last ones were my own additions, of course, but Uncle Vesemir approved reluctantly. "I will," I muttered, finishing the last bite of what could only be described as culinary magic. As I grabbed my gear and headed out, I realized that it had been a while since I'd talked to Corey. Since that incident. He hadn't even logged on for our usual games, and the silence between us was starting to eat at me. Louis had said that he was sulking, but Victoria had another take once she'd calmed him down from the whole nearly decapitated by my psychotic uncle incident. She had said that I made him face the reality of losing his immortality, that he was struggling with it, and what was going on at home wasn't helping either. I didn't ask her to go into detail, but it was clear that I needed to talk to Corey. He was my best friend, the guy who'd asked me to be his best man before all of this went down. And I was starting to get really worried about him. Sure, he was a vampire, an immortal creature of the night, but I knew how fragile his mental state was. The last thing that I wanted for him was to end it all by stepping into the sun one day. And so I drove the 30 minutes to his place, hoping that he was just sulking, hoping that whatever was gnawing at him wasn't something that couldn't be fixed. And when I pulled into his driveway, I noticed that there were more cars than usual. Corey's Prius and V's Corvette, of course, one of the few things that she'd taken with her when she'd left her mother's house. But there was also a beat-up white van and a little brown beater that looked more rust than actual paint. I parked behind the Prius and made my way to the stairs, the weight of what I had to say pressing down on me. Corey opened the door, and there was a look of fear in his eyes when he saw me, which was impossible to miss. "Hey, can we talk?"
"Sure."
Despite my uncle's instructions, I left my kit and my amulet in the car.
Is it just you?"
Corey said, his eyes darting around as though he was afraid someone might be watching. I could see that there was worry there, the concern that my uncle had come with me, and I nodded. Of course, man. I wouldn't bring him here after what he did. And he relaxed slightly, but I couldn't miss how his gaze still flickered nervously around the porch, like he was expecting someone or something to jump out from the shadows. I just wanted to check on you, man. I haven't seen you in a couple weeks or heard from you at all. And I also wanted to apologize for I hesitated, not sure of how to frame it, but eventually I went with the truth. My uncle. And Corey seemed surprised, though the surprise faded quickly.
Oh yeah, I guess that would track. So this is the long-lost side of your family, then?
And I nodded, my gaze drifting towards the ground for a moment. Yeah. I'm beginning to see why my mom left. He's training me, though. Training me to
hunt me.
Corey finished, his voice low and hesitant, like he was scared to say it too loudly, and the lump in my throat tightened. Training me so that way I'm not so useless the next time that we have to fight the Chosen or whatever else comes our way. And he looked up sharply, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing.
You know I don't think of you as useless. You saved a few of us when the skinwalkers took over the mortuary. You helped us in ways that we couldn't have in the sewer, too. I don't think any of us see you as a burden. You're our friend, Tyler. We like helping you. It's what friends do.
And that lump in my throat felt heavier. And I struggled to find the words. I don't know what to say.
Hopefully it's how you talk to your homicidal uncle about not staking house guests.
I couldn't help but laugh. Yeah, you had to set up some boundaries after that one. We continued to talk for a while, discussing what had been happening lately. The training, the shocking revelation about my uncle, and how Corey was handling things. We agreed that the next time, Corey would just knock before delivering supplies. And then I realized that I had been monopolizing the conversation, and so I changed the subject. How are you, though, man? How are things going around here?
Pretty good,
He said, but there was a hint of hesitation in his voice.
Dad is still mostly unconscious, but the guys we have coming in say he's looking better. He's still taking blood, and he hasn't dissolved yet, so those are good signs. V and I are happy, living together and getting ready for the baby.
And with that, he turned a little red, and then added,
Some of that is why she's so stressed out.
Yeah, I can imagine the baby's putting a lot on her. The cravings, the kicking, and the...
Actually, the baby has been pretty mild. V has a craving for blood now. Baby's going to be an AB positive lover, like his grandpa. But the real headache has been from...
He chewed his lip, his eyes glancing away.
outside sources.
And I nodded, already suspecting what he meant. The Robinsons giving you guys trouble, huh? I guess it was bound to happen. It is her grandkid, after all. But then Corey laughed softly. But it wasn't the kind of laugh that reached his eyes.
It might be easier if I just showed you. Come on.
And he took me inside, and through the Gothic architecture that was both equal parts vampire chic and procrastination cleaning practices, and then through and into the parlor. Victoria was laid out on a love seat, her stomach swollen with pregnancy, and her legs pulled into a milky reverse V as four others who I weren't familiar with were working around her. They were attaching leads to her stomach, taking reads and measuring things that might as well be sorcery to me, and generally doing a lot of low chattering. One of them was hunched over a computer, reading printouts and making notes, but the other three were swarming like flies as they took readings. They wore a collection of white short-sleeve button-up shirts that were undone with a variation of anime, superhero, and graphic t-shirts underneath. The white shirts all did have this strange symbol on the back with a large blue V inside of a circle with some scribbles beneath it that I couldn't read. What exactly am I looking at? I asked Corey, drawing the attention of one fellow who turned around and pushed his glasses up his nose. I don't want to be offensive, but there was no better way to describe it other than he looked like a dork. Like a cheesy dork, almost like a character of a dork. He had this dark, short hair slicked down to something that resembled alfalfa from the Little Rascals, minus the cowlick. His pockets were stuffed with pens and things of which had bled onto his shirt, and beneath it, I could see slacks that were held up by, honest-to-God, suspenders. He had these big, thick glasses that were so large that they reminded me of satellite dishes that people had in their yards from the early 2000s. Those bifocals of Reddit mod embodiment made me wonder about the ecosystem of vampire dorks and vampire jocks, but I had to put that thought aside as he gallumped over. "Ah, a fellow truth seeker, be not afraid, human, for I am a man of science. I will do thee no harm. William Wallamore, Ph.D. in biomedical studies and gene theory, at your service." He pumped my arm twice before releasing me. And Corey went on to introduce me as Tyler, his friend, the mortician, which he kind of added that last part rather pointedly. The vampire drew himself up a little taller after hearing this. "Ah, a fellow man of science, though it may be performed on the deceased, I have heard you spoken in quite a high regard, and I am pleased to meet you. Cornelius, did you bring him in to see our research?"
No, he just stopped by, and I thought...
You thought
Victoria cawed from the love seat.
that you would invite another spectator to my personal hell, it sounds like. Well, please, come on in. I'd shit some corn for you, but I'm a little busy at the moment.
Corey started to say something, but one of the other researchers patted her on the hand and said,
There, my Rose. What you do is for the benefit of all our kind.
All your kind.
V grumbled, but waving me over as I came over. "What are they doing?" I asked again, and William seemed more than happy to talk about it. "Oh, it's fascinating. Just fascinating. You see, the recorded couplings between a member of the Dominus succubus and the Dominicus vampirus are very rare. And I have a theory that they happen more than we're aware of. But..." He licked his lips as he glanced at Victoria before looking away. "Given the often nocturnal nature of the succubi habits, it is possible that the vampire are not aware that the Congress happened at all."
He's saying that because we often visit people in their sleep and are whores, we generally get thought of as a nice dream. How are you, Tyler? How have you been?
"Good, V. Better than it appears you guys are." "Has this been going on long?" I asked Corey. "Oh, no," William broke in. "Our good friend Cornelius only told us about this a week ago, or we would have been here much sooner."
Thanks, love.
V said acidly.
Well, they knew I had a hot succubus girlfriend, but I didn't know it was a secret that we were pregnant.
"Oh, I nearly forgot. Allow me to introduce my colleagues," he said, indicating the other 3 vampires with him. "This here is Thaddeus Mansfield, Doctor of Pharmacology and Phlebotomy Science, Klaus Gluermensch, and Doctor of Gene Theory and Genetic Abnormalities, and Chromosomal Science. And finally, we have Francis Kurtzman, Engineer and Computer Science Expert."
I don't understand why you insist on introducing me last,
Francis said as he looked up from the ribbon of data coming in out of the machine at his elbow.
What I do is just as important as your work. The only difference is that I don't have a PhD behind my name.
And William rolled his eyes. Well, Frank, when they come out with a doctorate for hooking up computers and running Cat 5, I guess you'll be a doctor too."
This again. I'm a graduate of MIT, Wally. I'm as qualified to be here as any of you.
"Oh. Well, it's just too bad MIT didn't give you a doctorate for watching lights on a monitor." And they all tittered a little at that, except for Francis. But V seemed to have enough of it.
Okay, enough. I told you all you could have 4 hours in the evening, and it's been 5. I need to rest. So that means get out.
And they all made little noises like kids being told that they had to go to bed after just one more story. But they started packing it up as they rolled it all out. She turned to Corey, clearly trying not to snap at him and asking him if he could show them out while she took a minute to herself. She kind of did look overwhelmed, something that I guess I couldn't really fault her for. And Corey nodded as he came to the same conclusion. William's phone rang as he packed up, and the image on his screen was that of a busty Nordic goddess, one that might even put V to shame. But he rolled his eyes at her like she was an annoying kid sister. Caught ya again," he said, hitting decline. "She just doesn't get it that my work is more important than Netflixing and chilling." "I'm a little surprised at you. I don't think that I've seen anyone refuse a call from a woman like that," I said as we walked out with them. "I mean, now, my girlfriend is no slouch in the looks department. I mean, she is smoking. But That girl is like supermodel hot,
Ah, yes.
Frank said.
The vampire lifestyle has its, drawbacks. I blame women's literature, honestly.
Heck, even Frank gets his share of women, and he's not even up for a Nobel Prize, William added, drawing a dark look from their tech guy. We were on the porch now, and I was still shaking my head. I guess it's just a little surprising, I said, drawing a questioning look from William. Why would it be? Men of science with good genetic stock have always been sought out by women of substance. The allure of undeath and the pull of the night all add to a natural sex appeal of all mysteries that surround science. I'm sure that in your line of work, even you find your own sort of coffin chasers. No, I can't say as digging in dead bodies has ever gotten me any dates. Well, I can imagine that the presence of your unique bloodline might, unless it's something else that you're maybe keeping a secret, William said, his eyes glittering. And I gave Corey an arching look, wondering how much he had told them about his very unique situation here. I mean, good sir, I would pay you handsomely for a vial of your blood. Just for study, of course. The mixing of the blood from an ancient line of monster hunters and a fantasy prospect of someone who is a generational mortician from the Garvey line would be extraordinary. For some, I'm sure, but I'm sorry, no. My uncle has had enough of a problem with me giving it to Corey, and would probably have a fit if he heard that I was just giving it away to anyone else now. And William deflated a little. Oh, that's quite the shame. Well, perhaps some other time. Cornelius, we shall see you and your lovely Victoria tomorrow night. Until then, my coterie and I will say goodnight, he said, dipping into a little bow before departing to a rusty hulk of a car and following the van the others were in. And I watched them go, shaking my head as I finally got to read the little writing under the logo on the van. Valheim Research and Eternal Struggle for Knowledge. Quite an interesting group you got there.
Yeah, they are.
So where'd you meet them? Vampire University or something?
Oh, Satan, no. I didn't have the marks to get into VU, not even after 8 years of vampire cram school. No, they were looking for people to join their Vampire the Masquerade game on the Palantir. It's like our Facebook, and I've been playing with them ever since.
And I laughed. I couldn't help it. D&D vampire nerds? Now I've heard everything.
No, D&D is just for special occasions. Here lately it's been Axis and Allies, ever since our Vampire the Masquerade game fell apart. Usually they're too busy for anything fun, though. When they learned that we could hang out, and they could make a major scientific discovery, they nearly crapped a bird. They're all about multitasking.
And Corey went on to tell me that this group of vampires were the good guys, and that they were completely trustworthy. They were neutral. They aligned with no faction, family, or other vampire group. And their sole motivation? An insatiable thirst for knowledge. What drew them to each other wasn't just their staggering intellect, but also a unique gift that they shared when turning others. Apparently, they had this supernatural ability to attract almost any woman. Like, absurdly so. Women would fall head over heels for them, and some even had left their husbands, broke out of prison, or gone through extreme plastic surgeries just for a chance to be with them. However, they had this ability less as a blessing and more of a colossal burden. And when I asked Corey why, he said that because these guys were only romantically interested in one thing. Anime girls. Not even cosplayers stood a chance. They exclusively loved the 2D, wide-eyed, pastel-haired creations of Japanese animation. Real women didn't interest them in the slightest, leaving them perpetually unsatisfied. And then Corey and I shared a laugh. Then things got a little quiet, so I decided to ask, how's the baby? Feel bad that I hadn't been keeping up with the pregnancy of my best friends. Is it coming along okay?
Oh, yes, very okay. I think that's really the only reason that V puts up with these weird science club guys. They've told us more about our child's development than any doctor we went to. Vampire medicine is strange, to say the least, and vampire OBGYNs aren't unheard of, but they're pretty rare. Most of them are quacks, too, so these guys being able to tell us that our kid is doing okay is kinda huge.
And I patted his shoulder. I liked to see Corey like this. He was usually a ball of nerves and anxiety. But the moments when I got to see him at ease were a rare treat. And Corey deserved it. He lived a rough life under his father's constant comments and a lack of notice, and then, just as his father was beginning to warm up to him, he had been thrust into a position where he needed to take care of not just himself, but the business. And he had done well under this newfound responsibility. And it was nice to see him comfortable in his own skin for a change. I'm glad. I know what this means to you, and I want this to be as painless for both of you as possible. We talked a little more, and then I left around 10:30 with a warm feeling in the pit of my stomach. My friends were happy, and my own business and relationship were going well. And I had a new branch of family tree to slowly explore. And it felt good, too. It was nice to get out and do things. And I felt like I could take on the world if I needed to in that moment. And then, thinking of my own relationship tickled something in the back of my brain. And when it finally came bursting out, I slammed on the brakes and I cursed like a sailor. I spun around and I started driving like hell to breakfast for Sarah's house, knowing that I was about to be in the doghouse.